to Canadian farmers and not our competitors. It adds to our cost of drying grain, and 2019 was a terrible year because we couldn't get any grain off dry. It adds to the cost of nitrogen fertilizer manufacturing, custom trucking, and rail transportation. It is unlikely the tax will alter consumption of these uses, but it does decrease competitiveness of Canadian farmers who can't pass on this added cost to their customers. And if we're so interested in carbon, why isn't there offset that would pay farmers to sequester carbon if their farming practices indeed do that? And with that, I will end, and hopefully I'm within my time.
Yes, you are, sir. Thank you very much. On to our Assembly of First Nations, Ms. Whiteduck, Director of Economic Sector, and Risa Schwartz, Legal Counsel. Welcome. Glad to have you here today.
Miigwech, thank you. Kwe Kakina, members, chair, and fellow witnesses. Nindo Chiba, Kirigan Zibi, Algonquinaki, an Indigenous cause, Judy Whiteduck. And I just wanted to acknowledge yourselves, all of you, myself and the territory before we begin. We have a brief set of remarks that we'll share and which I will start with. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation to the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations to appear before your committee to inform the study of Bill C-4. The National Chief has sent his regrets due to other commitments, and we are pleased to be here on his behalf. My name is Judy Whiteduck, and I'm the Director of the Economic Sector. I'm joined by Risa Schwartz, our Legal Counsel on International Trade Matters. The AFN is a national organization advocating for First Nation citizens in Canada, which includes more than 900,000 First Nation people, both living on reserves and in towns and urban centers. First Nation leaders direct the work of the Assembly of First Nations through resolutions passed at Chiefs' Assemblies. In 2019, the AFN passed Resolution 37-2019, which was continued advocacy on Canada's international trade agreements to achieve economic reconciliation, which urged greater participation of First Nations in international trade negotiations and called upon Canada to include a trade and Indigenous peoples chapter in future international trade agreements. The AFN has a specific Chiefs Committee on Economic Development, which includes First Nation trade relations. In 2017, the National Chief was welcomed by Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, to be a member of the NAFTA Council. At an officials level, Risa Schwartz and I also participate on the Indigenous Working Group on International Trade for Canada, the United States, Mexico Agreement, CUSMA. While there's more work to do, this work has resulted in the most inclusive international agreement for Indigenous peoples to date. I will now ask Risa to provide additional comments on CUSMA and as well to make a recommendation for an amendment to Bill C-4. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. With the ratification of CUSMA, Canada, working together with First Nations, will be taking steps to make international trade more inclusive and more equitable for Indigenous peoples, and especially for Indigenous women. CUSMA didn't ultimately include a trade and Indigenous peoples chapter, but the text of the final agreement mainstreamed many important provisions for First Nations. CUSMA maintains Canada's traditional reservations, exceptions, and exclusions in the areas of services, investment, environment, and state-owned enterprises. It continues the WTO agreement on procurement carve-outs for Indigenous businesses. It contains provisions that recognize the important role that Indigenous peoples play in conserving the environment. There is a new emphasis in CUSMA on cooperation activities to promote and enhance opportunities for Indigenous businesses in the chapter on small and medium-sized enterprises. Indigenous peoples are the youngest and fastest growing demographic in Canada, and opportunities for Indigenous business means opportunities for women and for youth. There is a new provision in CUSMA for handicraft Indigenous textiles and apparel goods, which are now eligible for duty-free treatment. And, importantly, for the first time in a Canadian trade agreement, CUSMA includes protections for inherent and treaty rights through a new general exception in Article 32.5, Indigenous Peoples' Rights. The general exception clause is much stronger than we've seen in other agreements. This new exception clause covers the entire agreement and applies to Indigenous peoples in all 3 countries. It'll allow all 3 states to take actions to fulfill their legal obligations to Indigenous peoples. And we'd like to note the investor-state dispute settlement will be phased out as between the United States and Canada. ISDS is a threat to Indigenous peoples' rights. All these matters are groundwork for positive change. Once CUSMA is ratified, we must work together to realize economic gains and to ensure that these provisions are implemented in a manner that provides for greater economic equity for First Nations. We note that the mandate letter for the Minister of Public Services and Procurement includes that at least 5% of federal contracts awarded must be to businesses managed and led by Indigenous peoples. This commitment needs to be monitored by each federal department and reported upon to Cabinet on an annual basis to ensure that the target is being met. Progress in meeting the 5% target should also be published by the Government of Canada for transparency. While CUSMA is an example of the difference it makes to engage with Indigenous peoples at an early stage, there must be increased opportunities for First Nations to participate directly in international trade negotiations, consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Assembly of First Nations will continue to advocate that Canada moves beyond engagement and invites First Nations to the negotiations table. Includes trade and Indigenous peoples chapters in all new or modernized international trade agreements. Explicitly acknowledges the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in international trade and investment agreements. Ensures that a general exception to protect Indigenous peoples' rights, such as the one in CUSMA, is a red line item for negotiation agreements. Like New Zealand, Canada must commit to protecting Indigenous rights in international trade agreements. This is not a matter that should be up for negotiation. As well, we ask that Canada halt the negotiation of new ISDS provisions in new international trade and investment agreements, and to remove ISDS provisions when older agreements are being modernized. Finally, we ask Canada to invest in programs and services needed for First Nations trade networks and internation trade so that additional capacity can be established in First Nation trade policy and programs and services. We are also here today to recommend an amendment to Bill C-4. The bill is missing a non-derogation clause. The non-derogation clause amendment was proposed previously by the National Chief when he appeared before this committee during the study for Bill C-100. All implementing legislation for international agreements that have the potential to impact inherent and treaty rights must include a non-derogation clause. It is not just international trade and investment agreements that can impact inherent and treaty rights, but also how the agreement is implemented through domestic regulatory and policy matters. A non-derogation clause will clarify that the Act and CUSMA shall be construed as to uphold existing Aboriginal and treaty rights recognized and affirmed in our Constitution. Chi Miigwech for the opportunity today to present to the Standing Committee on International Trade.
Thank you very much. On to the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, Matthew Poirier, Director of Policy, and Ellen Arcan, Chief Economist.